Join us today for this episode of Chai Chat with Zeba Hassan.
In this Chai Chat, we look at the Jinn, those supernatural creatures in Islamic theology. In her podcast, The Hidden Djinn, my guest, Rabia Chaudry, takes an in-depth look at the Jinn lore. She describes Jinn as ancient, powerful, and hidden from the human eye.
Like us, they're born and they die. Like us, they fall in love, marry, have children. And like us, they hate and fight and destroy.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. This is Zeba Hassan with Mommyingwhilemuslim on our special Chai Chat episode talking about the Hidden Djinn. I am joined by my beautiful co-host, Solat Zaidi, who is recovering actually from surgery. So this girl is a trooper and she is lying in bed, hopefully taking care of herself, and here today. Assalamu alaikum, Solat. How are you today, my dearest?
Walaikum assalam, Zeba. Thanks. Thanks for still having me on, even though I may not sound like my usual perky self. But I just wanted to, get on because it's going to be my two favorite podcast ladies on today, and I did not want to miss them.
Ooh.
And I just wanted to just also have this opportunity to give, a shout out to the village of people, including you, my, SOSS sisters, my in-laws, my sister-in-laws, who've honestly been so kind and, wonderful to me in this time, especially with my family being so far away. So thank you so much. It really does take a village to, get through life. So thank you.
It takes a
Appreciate it.
village. And do you want to share the good news with everybody?
Yes, so I got my results back. I don't have any malignant cells. Alhamdulillah, really appreciative.
Alhamdulillah.
And I just want to,
We were super
again,
grateful.
yep. So remember, this is October, Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Just is another reason why everyone should be checking themselves and staying on top of it. So, I just wanted to put that in there. So again, thank you, family, friends. You guys all know who you are. Thank you.
No, and we're just so grateful that alhamdulillah everything turned out okay. And I love the fact that you are talking about breast cancer awareness. If you have any kind of family history, please go get yourselves checked out. Or I believe it's after 45 where you should be getting annual mammograms. So ladies, we need to take care of our tatas, as they like to call them, or how my boys lovingly describe them as their boobies because they still think they own them. But we're talking about a subject that I don't think a lot of people, one that live in America, necessarily understand the Jinn mythology, and I know it's something that is pretty close to my heart, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. And Solat, we all talk about hearing Djinn stories growing up, and sometimes they're mentioned together with like demons and devils and or ghosts, right, or spirits, and we're not quite sure where they're coming from. And the reality of the situation is that they can be just like us, according to Islamic lore and Islamic history. They can be just like us. They have very human like attributes. And Rabia Chaudry, she is now the podcast host of The Hidden Djinn, which is now one of my favorite podcasts. She probably is a little bit more famous for some of these other podcasts, like Serial, which kind of started that whole movement, and which is one of the main reasons why I got into podcasting, to be very honest with you, because it was something that really held my attention. And I know this is probably everybody wants to call and talk to her about Adnan Syed. We're going to talk about that on another day, because right now I think the jinns are talking to us since we just lost power, just came back on. We had some tech difficulties, and we're just grateful, Rabia, to have you on. And I think we're the first interview about the Hidden Djinn. So I am so excited about that. Thank you for joining us today on Mommyingwhilemuslim. I think we lost your audio. See, the
Oh,
jinns don't want you talking. We lost your audio, and now we
you
can hear
hear me
you.
now? Oh, can you
Now
hear
we
me
can hear
now?
you.
Okay,
Yes.
all right, great. No, but I was gonna say thank you guys for having me on. This is indeed the first interview. Who knows? It might be the last, but this is the only time I've been
Oh, you never
invited
know.
to on to speak about this particular podcast. I get invited to lots of different shows, but it's never about this subject. Although I think this came out of left field for a lot of people. They're like, "Wait, she's doing what?" So,
Yeah, exactly. I was
yeah.
literally like, what is her connection to this?" And I just wanted to be able to chat with you about it, and when
Yeah,
Solat made the connection, I was like, "Okay, I know everybody wants to talk to her about all these other things. We're
yeah,
gonna leave that for another day. Politics
sure.
are coming up. We're gonna take a break from politics today, everybody,
Mm,
and we're gonna
yeah,
talk about these mythological beings
mm,
called jinn.
yeah.
What is a jinn to our non-Muslim audience? Can you describe, and you describe it so eloquently in your beautiful, like, baritone voice, and I listen to it at nighttime. So, do you want to talk a little bit about what actually is a jinn?
Yeah, I mean, so, growing up, all of us who grew up Muslim, we all kind of had the same experience where you get a couple of Muslim kids together and we tell Jinn stories. We'd swap Jinn stories, which was really parallel to kind of the campfire ghost story tradition that other cultures have. But the understanding of Jinn is different for us because it's more than just a mythology, it's more than just folklore. This is an inherent part of our faith. I mean, the Jinn are mentioned like 40 times in our actual scripture. And the way Muslims understand it, or it's explained to us, at least in our scriptures, this is that God created three kinds of beings. He created man out of clay, man and other material things that are in this world out of clay. He created the angels out of light, and he created the jinn from fire. And so we have always, like, in our faith tradition, we believe that there is this entire, like, I don't know how, like, being, this entire creation that we can't see but exists. It exists in a different plane. Sometimes they interact with our world, sometimes they don't. They have powers we don't, and yet we are still superior to them. We're still the most superior creation in the eyes of God, which I think is a fascinating thing. And there are just centuries of stories and folklore that has come out of this, but it actually goes well back before, Islamic theology. I mean, the roots of jinn um, stories and traditions, and a lot of the origin stories you can be find in Jewish literature, in pre-Jewish, like Babylonian, Assyrian literature. It rabbit holes that just never end, basically. So
Wow. So, I had a question. So, in your podcast, you talk about that three Muslim people can't get together without swapping gin stories. What are, what are some of your like favorite gym stories, or, um, are they like famous, infamous? I mean, by now, I'm sure you've heard a lot.
yeah, I mean, well, since launching the podcast, we have a Gmail that people can send us stories to, and I've heard some crazy, crazy. I've read some crazy stories. I'm going to read some of them in the show later, but um, for me growing up, there were a few families that every time we got together, they would always just tell me and my siblings gin stories, and I thought it was mostly to freak us out. But there was one in particular that always stuck with me, and I actually tell this at the beginning of one of the episodes, and that is that this family was traveling back to their village in Pakistan at some point, and they had to take a train from the big city, Lahore, to the village. And in the train, the younger boys, they encountered this woman who was wearing, like, it looked like a burqa all the way from the head to the toe covered. Um, and they realized at one point she stretched out her legs and her feet were backwards. And, that imagery always stuck with me. It was terrifying to hear it as a child. It's terrifying to think about it as an adult. And, they were scared witless. And when they told their elders in the village, they're like, "Oh, you saw a jinn or a jura," like it's a kind of jinn. And that's how you identify them, as with their feet backwards. Now, growing up, it was just these kinds of stories, but it wasn't until I really started, like, doing some deep research into the subject, like earlier this year, that I realized that the foot thing is a real thing. I mean, like, you find it over and over again in different stories, including stories about, for example, the Queen Bilqis, the Queen of Sheba. There
Mhm.
are stories that she was half jinn and that her feet were like cloven hooves. I mean, so there's something about feet. Like, jinn can transform themselves, but the feet give them away. So that was a great story, and it's always stuck with me. But I didn't have a lot of my own personal stories. My family was we weren't into the mystical stuff. We were kind of like straight up Wahhabi style, very
Mm-hmm.
literal. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I had a couple of weird, uh, inexplicable experiences myself that I was like, oh, that must be a jinn thing. Like, I just chalked it up to the jinn.
So this is the funny thing. Like my husband, it cracks me up because we talk about Djinn stories all the time, and I'll get to my personal story in a little bit. And we've had a Djinn essentially with our family, and actually my sister was supposed to record, and my mom was, and they were just did not want to go down that rabbit hole right now.
Mhm.
That's essentially followed us. From my earliest memories. So I've always believed in it, but my husband would always laugh at us and he's like, "Okay, so why are there no jinns in like America? Like why are all these jinn stories in like Pakistan and
Mhm.
India and Arab countries?" And when in listening to your podcast, I learned that the Jinnistan, which I think is kind of where the jinn actually live, is on that part is in that part of the world. So it would make sense that a majority of the Jinn stories would occur in that part of the world. So what do you say to these people that are kind of like the naysayers, or is there a difference between a jinn, right, that has a lot of human attributes and they're actually living beings in a different dimension, or spirits or ghosts or devils? Like how do you differentiate, how can we differentiate between these types of mystical beings?
Well, I'll answer the second question first, which is how do you differentiate? And I remember early on in my research, I reached out to a scholar named Ali Alumi. He's a professor out in the Philadelphia area, and he
Hmm.
does these amazing Twitter threads on jinn. And I interviewed him actually for our Patreon series. And this is one of the questions I had. I said, listen, I every resource I look into like classifies jinn in different ways, and it's really confusing. Like, which jinn is this, and what is a ghost, and what is a spirit? And he said, there's really just no hard and fast. Like scholars aren't sure. Like people who even are have scholarship in this stuff disagree. There are some people who will say all of these entities are some manifestation of jinn. Others will say, no, there's a difference between jinn as a creation, jinn that live and die and have families and, actually conduct lives like we do, and like souls that might linger after a human being dies. So I don't, there's not a definitive answer. Nobody really knows exactly the answer. But about the naysayers, there's a couple things. Number one, it's always interesting to me when people who are Muslim, who profess, to be Muslim and believe in Islam, have difficulty with this as a
Hmm.
concept because it's too fantastical for them. Because we can't really take the Quran and say, well, I want to believe in this, but not this. Like it's like
Right.
you kind of
You
can't do
can't pick
that,
and
and
choose. It's
you
not a
can't really
cafeteria meal. That's what
right
I tell
and
people. It's not a cafeteria meal. You can't pick and choose the peas versus the mashed
right
potatoes. You kind of have to
and
eat them all together.
you gotta have it. Yeah, and the thing is that, it's not even like it's something that's kind of like a passing, vague reference. No, this is something that God is very explicit about. Beyond that, and I've said this a number of times in my Patreon series, because that's where I have conversations and interview people. I say, listen, if I am somebody who already says I believe in God, right? I believe in God.
Mhm.
The idea of God to me is much more supernatural, fantastical, magical, crazy than the idea of like jinn. So if I can believe in God and I can believe in angels, then of course I can believe in jinn. I'm like, it's just it's not beyond the realm of my imagination. But as far as like why do you experience things here, not there? I don't think that's true. I don't think there's a single culture that doesn't have its own really rich history of supernatural experiences, unexplicable or inexplicable phenomena. The Celtic lore is really rich. I mean,
Mhm.
I have gotten the craziest thing to me is that most of my listeners are not Muslim. That's to be honest, at least from the
Mhm.
ratings and reviews that I get. Most of them are not Muslim. Most people
Welcome
are
to the club.
oh, well, there you go. Maybe
I'm
Muslims
like,
are still
why do we
discovering
not have
podcasts.
Muslim listeners, everybody?
I don't know. Maybe they're still getting ready, not discovering podcasts yet. But I have gotten messages from people who are Hindu, people who have come from animist backgrounds, like Filipino backgrounds, people who of like every kind of background possible, and have said these the descriptions of the beings you're talking about exist in our cultures too. They're just called this instead of this.
Right.
And so I actually don't think it's true. I think you find these kinds of phenomena in so many different places. I mean, even things like, we grew up with like poltergeist. What is a poltergeist? Like
Hmm.
what are these, hauntings? What are these possessions? I mean, we understand those things as jinn, but they do exist in Western societies too.
So, Rabia, when you listen to these Jinn stories, have any of them like frightened you or given you the shivers that you're like, crap, why am I listening to this right now before I go to bed?
You know what's crazy to me? I was really scared. Okay, this podcast has been in the work for like 2.5 years. Okay. And I was scared to actually start researching it and writing it and like really getting down into it. Like we had already agreed to do, I had agreed to do this a while ago. I was scared to do it, but the more research that I did and the more I learned, the less scared I got. I actually am not scared at all at this point, for a couple of reasons. I think first of all, I expected, and my husband is a Quran hafiz and alim, so he's like total religious guy, and he's just like, oh, we are totally getting possessed by the time this is done. Like you have to be
I
careful.
know exactly.
But he's the one who was always like praying and blowing on me and blowing on the house and trying to protect us. And but nothing, nothing has happened. Nothing has happened in this whole year that I've been working on this project very intensely to frighten me or to say that suddenly there's a new entity in the house or something. There's that, but also the other realization I have is that if we really believe that these jinn exist and they are as powerful as we know they are, for the most part, that means they kind of don't mess with our lives. Like most of them don't. Most of them just doing their thing, living their lives, and we're living our lives. There might be some who do want to, but they're very one-off, or they're people who are actually actively try to invite them into your life, and that's different. And people are able to do that. But I think for the most part, the jinn are just kind of like, look, listen, you stay in your realm and leave us in our realm, and we're all good. So
Yeah, everybody
I
has
don't
to
have
just
to
stay
really.
in their own in their own parts. Like I know we have a comment from Jana Peterson that says like I think it's interesting that we have this older figure with dark long hair that
Yeah,
many people across all religions or
yeah,
cultures you've mentioned have seen or talked about this person. And
yeah.
I believe you mentioned this in one of your episodes. So do you want to talk about her? And I believe was she like, isn't she related, or is she like the queen of the jinns on some level? Like I feel like that was part of her history.
So no, I mean, okay, so the person, or the creature that you're referring to as Queen of the Jinn, or at least someone who is known as a Queen of the Jinn, her name is Lilith, and she
Hmm.
is a vampire figure, and she comes to
She's
us really
literally a
from.
man eater, right? Like isn't that what
She's a
she
man
does?
eater. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, she's a man eater. She has a grudge against humanity, that goes back to Adam. And according
Hmm.
to Jewish apocryphal literature, she was supposed to be Adam's actual first wife. It's a crazy story. She
Oh.
was supposed to be Adam's first wife, and what happened was she and Adam got together and she refused to be submissive. So I'm talking about purely in a sexual way. Adam wanted her on, she wanted to be on top. I mean, and
Ooh,
Adam's like,
okay.
yeah. And Adam said, you can't do that, because you're my wife and you have to be submissive. And she was enraged and she was like, forget this, I'm out of here. So she flew out of heaven. And now this is, of course, again, this is Jewish tradition. I don't want Muslims out there saying, oh my God, she's making up stuff out of her religion. This is from the Jewish lore. And then she flew to the earth where she basically uh, decided she was going to have an eternal enmity against mankind because of Adam's rejection of her. And then Adam got Eve and, whatever. And so that's one. But the figure you're talking about, the old woman with the long hair, that dark figure, that actually I didn't mention that in the series, the main series. I talked about that with one of the guests I had. I think it was Shaheen Basha, who is a journalist, and a professor, an amazing woman. She came on as a guest and she told me about this experience where her entire life, her family, and different people in her family have seen this figure over and over. And her husband used to laugh at her until he saw the
Mhm.
figure one day,
Mhm.
years into their marriage. And that is a very common figure people see. In some places, it's called the old hag. In
Mhm.
others, I mean, like it just has like different, like. But as far as Shaheen is concerned, she doesn't really know who that woman is, where she comes from, what it is. It could just be, I do think we know that jinn can shift their shapes. And
Yes.
I think that what jinn do is they shift their shapes to scare you in a context that they know will scare you. And that's a
Mhm.
figure for a lot of us that will just scare us. A woman with a dark female shaped figure with hair all in front of her and standing at the foot of your bed. I mean, that's like a nightmare for a lot of people. It might not be a nightmare, let's say, for some people in a different cultural context. So they don't experience it that way. What's interesting is one of the things I've learned is that for jinn who do want to harm and attack human beings, they have to find some kind of a vulnerability in you. And one of the ways to get like a vulnerability in your psyche is to frighten you. So they look for a way to
Mhm.
frighten you so they can have some power over you. Or maybe they want you out of their space. I don't know.
So, Rabi, I mean, just, piggybacking on what you said about women, what are your thoughts on the way the men and women are? I mean, I almost felt like, just like with every other story, women are treated more poorly in these jinn stories. What's your thoughts upon
Mhm.
that?
Yeah. So this is something also I learned a lot about because I growing up, when you hear about jinn stories, you don't really differentiate between male jinn and female jinn, but of course they should be differentiated because they are differentiated. And the stories around female jinn are interesting. I don't, I initially went into this with the same kind of perspective sold up. I was like, oh, these are stories that societies have made up to make female jinn like dastardly, in the same way that, for example, we have in some religious faiths how women are inherently like kind of evil, or Eve
Mhm.
ate the apple and she caused the downfall of man. Like there's all this blame on women, right? And I thought these jinn stories, these female jinn stories, do the same thing. And I think to a certain extent they do, because a lot of the female jinn stories are around controlling sexuality. A lot of them are like lessons. Like if you come across a beautiful woman, she seduces you, and you end up sleeping with her, well, it's going to destroy your life and she's going to possess you forever. So it's like these warnings. Um,
Yes.
right. There's these warnings, but also there is built into that this really kind of dark notion that women's sexuality is dangerous, right? That
Yes.
so there's that. But the flip side of that to me is this, and that is, in many of these societies, we're talking about hundreds of years old societies, but even now, many women did not have a place of power. So in these stories, they kind of got a place of power, right? Like these stories finally showed women, or a female entity having power that women in the real world maybe couldn't have, having sexual freedom that women in the world couldn't have, having the ability to for vengeance and justice that women in the real world didn't have. So I kind of thought of it as a little bit empowering. And you know what's in North African cultures, where there's a lot of intersection between Muslim tradition and animist
Mhm.
tradition and other indigenous cultures, um, women are like really empowered. I mean, women are usually the kind of the lead sheikhs and exorcists in this. They conduct these ceremonies that are called zar ceremonies. They're able to control the jinn and have relationships with the jinn, and so it actually becomes a form of empowerment. So there's different aspects to this, and there's a lot of lessons in what we can draw from like what society's trying to tell us through these stories.
And let me ask you this, because I have to say, like, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, for lack of a better term. But we talk about jinn possessions pretty freely, I in the Indo-Pak culture, and I'm going to specifically, I can only speak to that, right? So if a girl, for instance, isn't listening to her parents, or she's possessed by a jinn, or if they're acting strangely or whatever the case may be, she's possessed by a jinn versus having a mental illness. So what
Right.
do you think about those types of circumstances, right? Where they just, honestly, if you watched, I think it was it Cuties on Netflix when the little girl was not acting, like they brought a shake in because they were like, is she possessed? Is something going on with her? And they were
I
like,
haven't seen it, but yeah.
yeah, but he essentially was like, there's nothing wrong with her. She's just doing what she needs to do, because I think a lot of parents would like to believe, instead of their
Yeah.
kids being their own people, that, maybe there's a jinn possessing them. So what do you say about those types of circumstances, and speak to that particular issue? Because I feel like a lot of mental health issues go underground because people would rather believe that a jinn is possessing them than, you have a mental illness of some sort.
Oh yeah, I did an entire episode on that, about
Mhm.
the like what happens when mental illness comes right up against like superstitious beliefs. And I even did an interview with that same week in that episode with a chaplain who's dealt a lot with these kinds of issues, uh, dealing with parents and people who are like, for example, the chaplain I had on, his name is Abdul Antepli. He told a really heartbreaking story of a young man who, he's a college chaplain, who was in college with him, a young Muslim man who was like, or a young man who said, I think there's a jinn that is compelling me to have homosexual feelings.
Mhm.
And this is a really, I mean, a heartbreaking situation where this young man is looking for an out. He's looking for a way because he feels whatever it is, terror, fear, shame, again, dealing with this in his life and with his family and society, and doesn't know how to square this circle in Muslim spaces. So he's like, it must be a jinn. And luckily this chaplain, Abdullah, is an incredible chaplain and human being and has wonderful pastoral skills. Um, he was able to manage it in a way that I thought really respected the young man in all different ways. And that was by not completely dismissing the idea that maybe there's something supernatural happening, but also just addressing the other issue. And then in the same week, I also had on a psychiatrist from the UK who does a lot of work around these, a Muslim psychiatrist. And he said also the same thing. He said, when you have these kinds of issues, number one, you don't want to dismiss a person's like sincerely held belief that there might be something
Mhm.
supernatural or happening to me. But what you do is you want to say, okay, let's kind of cover all bases, right? Let's try
Right.
the psychological intervention. Let's try the behavioral therapies. Let's try the medicinal therapies, and let's also bring in a spiritual and chaplains and religious leaders also, so you don't dismiss it. But I do think it's a big issue. It is ripe for abuse. It gets abused a lot
Mhm.
in a lot of societies. People take advantage of people who have mental health issues by saying, "Oh, I can get rid of your gin, pay me this much or do this." We know there are many cases in which men have physically and sexually abused young boys
Mhm.
and girls by saying that, leave them alone with us, we will cure them of the gin, and molesting them, throughout that time. So there's a lot of potential for abuse in those situations. And I have myself seen situations, and I even have family members where I've seen that there's clear psychiatric mental health issues, and the family is like, oh no, but it's jinn, or somebody put a
Mhm.
curse on her, or somebody did black
Yes.
magic. Yeah. Look, nobody, mental health, like we are very, our community as far as Muslims, like we don't yet quite fully embrace mental health awareness and
Mhm.
and therapy and all the, like, we just don't yet. We're not quite for us. It's always been, well, just read some Quran and pray some more and do the right thing, and you'll have peace of mind. And I think things are starting to change on that front. So, but it'll take some time.
Inshallah. Mm.
Inshallah. So, Rabia, we want you to share some testimonies that were put together by some of your listeners who listen to the podcast. Joe,
Sure.
thank you so much for doing this, and I hope the rest of you guys enjoy it.
Assalamu alaikum, Zeba. So, you asked for a Djinn story, and I got a good one for you. So, years back, I was 16. We were living in a town called Bahawalpur in Pakistan. My dad was posted there, and when I was coming back from my friend's house, and I was late because at Maghrib time you were supposed to be home, and I was running late, and so I was running in, and my mom could see me running in towards the house, and I bang into something and I fall down, and my mom looks around and said, "What happened to you?" I said, something hit me right here on my left side. And my mom goes, there was nothing around you. And I said, no, there was somebody. And I looked around also, and there was nobody. And from that day onward, I could hear somebody walking in my room, in the house. I could hear, and it was a woman because I could see her shadow in the house. I could hear her murmur, read Quran, like verses. And for years, I would scream in the middle of the night because I would feel like it was choking me. And sometimes I thought I was imagining all that. And now come fast forward it to 20 almost years later. I was 33, living on my own, going through divorce, and I needed some money, so I rented a room out of my house to somebody, a couple. And this girl, I left the house with to them to go to a vacation. When I come back from the vacation, she says, your house is spooked. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, there is a woman who walks around in this house. There's a presence of a woman. I can feel it and I can hear it. And that was the first time in my life I could say, okay, I was not wrong. Somebody could feel it. And yeah, every few days she would come and visit me. I could hear her in the room. I would close my eyes, start reciting Ayatul Kursi and all my calls, and my mom knew about it, and I didn't confide in a lot of people, but that's my story. Yep.
Here's my Djinn story. In my dad's home in Karachi, where he grew up, this house was built by my grandfather, and there's this white cat that hangs out there, and that cat has been there for about 60 years now. It's a little white kitten with one blue eye, one brown eye, and everyone has seen this kitten at least once or twice. First of all, it's the same cat being born over and over, but then that cat literally disappears. And then upstairs, where, you know, the balcony where they have clothesline, there's randomly white clothes hanging there, and sometimes people have seen an older gentleman standing there in those white clothes with a white cat, and everyone freaks out. But my grandmother would say, "Oh, it's a nice jinn. He's just a friend. He's a friendly ghost living in our house." And I remember we'd be so scared when we were kids, but we got used to it. And I've seen the cat. Everyone's seen the cat and the clothes and the old man. Scary.
I was
Wow.
trying to get her to send me a picture of the cat, and she didn't come back to me yet. So I was like, please send a picture of this. First of all, it sounds like a really cute cat, so I would want to see what it looks like. But that is true. Like a lot of the common themes is in Indo-Pak and Pakistan, and so mine is not, but it did start in India, and it started in Pakistan. And my mom told me this story, and my mom is a convert. She didn't really believe in any of this stuff, obviously, I'll have to say. One day she said, I was sitting on this bed, and she said, you kept staring out of the window. And then I went to you and said, what are you staring at? And I'm like 2 years old saying, oh, the eyes keep looking at me. Okay, so it started as early as that, where my mom was like, I'm looking outside thinking, is there a bird? Is there whatever? And she said, you were always so insistent that somebody was looking. You weren't afraid, but you always talked about somebody looking at you through the window. And then fast forward, we move. And honestly, this particular Djinn has more connection to my sister, to be honest with you, but we've all felt its presence, whether it came with us or was attracted to us for whatever reason. I do think it gets attracted to one or two people. And my sister did have some volatility in her teenage years, and so I think it manifested itself in a physical way, but you would literally hear people singing, no one's at home, doorknobs opening in front of you. So this is me saying I witnessed this myself. And I remember there was a story as I was lying in bed one day, and my parents, for whatever reason, put, one of those old school tube lights over my bed just for extra lighting. And it was in the middle of the night, and I vividly felt somebody talking to me, literally saying, get up now. And it was an instant. I get up and the light crashed on my pillow in the middle of the night. My mom comes running in, my dad comes running in, and of course they see the light thinking, what the heck happened to your face? And they're like, how did you wait? I'm like, somebody told me.
Oh my
And it
gosh.
was like a get up right now. And so this particular being, I feel like just follows us around. And
Yeah.
my husband was a naysayer, and we would go to Chicago for long periods of time in the summer, and then one day he was like, you're not going for that long. And I was like, what's going on? My housekeeper says that there was muddy footprints all over the house. And I'm like, what in the world is this? And my husband looked sheepish, and I essentially asked him, like, and as my door is opening right now by itself, I wish you guys could see this. Not a
Oh
joke.
no.
And I go to my husband, I'm like, did something happen? Whatever. And he's like, okay, you're gonna think I'm crazy. But he was home alone working. And he said while he was sitting in the office, he saw our closet door. He heard it and saw it open.
Mm,
And then a shoe didn't just drop off, it was like thrown into my
mm.
kitchen area. He
Wow.
didn't think it was a jinn. He thought somebody's in the house and not doesn't realize that I'm here. He called the police.
Oh
The
wow.
police went through the entire house, which was the footprints. That wasn't the jinn. And they were like, sorry, sir, there's nobody here. Nobody came in. We don't know. And he would continuously hear things in the house when we were
Mm,
gone. It was almost like it was irritated that we were gone. So he
mm.
comes to Chicago and was like, you're never leaving me for that long again, because whatever it is, I finally believe it, gets really annoyed when you guys aren't around. So I personally feel like whatever this being is, whether it's a spirit, jinn, obviously as a Muslim, I am more inclined to believe it as a jinn, is a positive influence. And I know whenever I
Mhm.
talk to Uzma about it, she's like, stop talking about it because then they'll come, which I
Right.
don't know how
That's what they
truthful that
say.
is. Is that
Yeah.
what they say? So why do they, why do they say that? So I just wanted to say, first of all, jinn can happen in America because this was the DMV area. So
Yeah.
we're gonna bleep where that is, but this is in the DMV area, and this is happening here.
Yeah.
One and two, people are afraid that when you do talk about it, they're gonna come. So where
Mm.
did that actually come from?
I don't know. I mean, I've read in some really old sources where scholars have said things like, when you talk about the jinn, they listen, they pay
Hmm.
attention. I mean, because suddenly they're like, oh, it's like if somebody's talking about me, right? And I'm passing
Right.
by, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, somebody talking about, like, it's like that.
Right.
That's a different thing than them showing up to harm you. Which
Yes.
which is less likely. Now we have to understand that, what scholars believe is that the jinn occupy different kind of metaphysical planes, and they even have
Hmm.
maybe their own jinnist or whatever, but they also can occupy earthly planes, but we in a different dimension kind of thing. Like, so they could share spaces with us, and in some instances they might just want to let us know they're here or mess with us
Hmm.
or whatever, but most of the time they're not, or warn you, like that this jinn warned you. um, it's rare. There's only a couple of circumstances where jinn actively will enter like human lives to like harm you. And number one is if somebody actually does like literally conjure them and summon them and send them your way, or just conjure them for themselves so they can like ask them to do things for them. Like there are people who ask jinn to do their bidding. The other thing is if you inadvertently hurt a jinn or insult a jinn, and so that's one reason you're not supposed to urinate under trees, because a lot of jinn live in trees and it can be insulting to them. So then they might want to try to harm you. But a third category is if a jinn falls in love with you and they just don't want to let
Hmm.
go. And I actually had a friend, and I told her story in one of the episodes, where that happened. This jinn like apparently followed her around for years, and she every time she would start getting serious with somebody towards a marriage and stuff, it would just act out and terrify her, and it would just ruin her whole life. So I don't think just talking about them, mentioning them, is enough to like get them to like they won't show up in a negative way. I think they might just be paying attention.
Yeah.
But
Their
yeah,
ears
yeah.
perk up.
It takes more than that. I mean, there are entire
Yeah.
books and books and books written about how you got to like do all these different rituals and fast for 30 days and all this crazy stuff to really, really summon them.
So, it's really, interesting to, talk about all the different themes that you've talked about as far as jinns go. Most of the time, like within Western culture, we only hear about ghosts more in a negative sense, not that they bring, apart from Casper, I don't know of any like good ghosts out there.
Hmm.
So, one of the, I mean, I don't have a crazy gin story like Zeba does, but I do remember this growing up when I was about, 8 years old. My mom, we had to take my younger sister to hospital because she got into rodent poison and started eating it.
Oh my
And
God.
Mm.
luckily she was fine. And then afterwards, obviously, mom isn't telling us how she found out, but I was eavesdropping between her and her sister to find out that my mom was putting up clothes in the clothesline outside. If this is England, we don't have, you know, dryers, so everything's outside. And she said she turned around and there was a man in a completely white outfit, in a white beard, who basically was pulling her and pointing in the direction of where my younger sister was inside. He essentially told my mom my sister was doing this. So
Wow.
again,
Mm.
this was a good person. That's why she said she wasn't scared. But I also
Hmm.
noticed the similarity about the color white. Why is it that white is considered such a good color, and even in the images it's the women wearing black that it's bad? I mean, I don't know, what's your thoughts on that?
That's going to open up a whole another podcast, right? With the whole imagery of the black and the white, with the black being always consistently a negative color and the white being this
Yeah.
pure,
Hmm.
puritanical color. So, yeah, what is that?
But I think, when we think about it, what we're thinking about that through a different lens right now, right? You're thinking about
Hmm.
through that kind of like a social justice lens and a racial equality
Hmm.
lens. But I think if you were to step back from that and think about it in the sense of what are people afraid of? They're afraid of the unknown. And darkness, when it's dark outside and you cannot see anything, that is the unknown. And so it's just what that darkness can hold, like can trigger a lot of fear in people. And I think that's what the white versus black actually signifies, is that the darkness signifies, the black signifies darkness and the white signifies illumination, so you can see, so it's not hidden. And I mean, that's how I understand it, at least from a kind of a supernatural perspective. Like that's why those colors seem to come up over and over when you talk about like good entities versus bad. I don't think they were ever meant to be understood in human racial terms, but
Right.
it's hard for us to separate that out now because we have these woke lenses, and so we see everything in a different way. But I don't think historically that's what it was. I think it's like the deep sea and deep space, and where there's darkness, there are things you don't know, that exist, and that's what's scary.
That's actually a really good point. I just think that too bad politics always plays a role right now, right? So I am looking at things from that
Yeah.
lens. So
Yeah.
thank you for
What I
correcting
do
me
what I
on
do object
that.
to what I do object to is when you have, and this is actually problematic, is when you have in media, you have like whenever somebody's shown as villainous, you have groups of people who are villains, they're almost always dark people. They're wearing dark clothing, and like the opposite. I mean, like we've seen this in a lot of different movies that are like um just movies like about like crusades and this and that. I mean, this happens over and over, but even in like Game of Thrones type of stuff, you see this again and again. You
Hmm.
see like the evil people, the villains are always like dark, they're dressed in dark. That's problematic, that's different.
That's actually a really good point. But I said that we weren't going to talk about any of your
Politics.
other podcasts, right, or
Yeah.
politics, right? So we weren't going to talk about Serial and how amazing what. But I've had a lot of personal questions that were like, okay, if she comes on, ask her this, and I'm going to ask an uncomfortable question too because I feel like this will be a good platform for you to chat about it. And you said
Sure.
everything was open and out in the open. So the
Yeah, yeah,
first thing
sure.
is, how is Adnan doing right now, and where are you guys in that case?
Adnan is doing okay. Last year was a tough year because that's when we kind of lost his very, very long
The
appellate
appeal.
fight.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so we have basically been regrouping, and so we've spent the last year with a new and expanded legal and investigative team. In fact, we just had a conference call on this past just a few days ago, where we have to basically look at all of our options, and decide what's next. And there are more options. You can always go back to state court again and again and file new appeals. You can go to federal court. He's never filed a federal appeal, which is called a federal habeas. He can file something called a writ of actual innocence. So there's all these different options. And the question was, what makes sense? What should you do first? What evidence do we have and we don't have that see when this appeal that was finally denied last year was begun, it was begun like 10 years prior. So
Yeah.
we have more evidence now than we did then, and so we have the basis of other appeals. So now, I mean, basically we have we're just coming together. I mean, I think his lawyer is going to be ready to file, because obviously you want to make sure all your ducks are in a row, probably in the spring. And I'm
Inshallah.
pretty excited with the new strategy that is being considered, because we were kind of stuck with a couple of issues. We were, arguing through the courts, and now we're not. Now we can bring up all kinds of stuff that's come to light in the last few years. So
That's actually really good, because I know that for people that don't know what we're talking about, I don't know how you have been living under a rock, to be honest with you, if you do not know what we're talking about. But I know there is an amazing HBO that you were
that's the
executive
poster.
producer on. That's the poster, the case against Adnan Syed, and
Yeah.
you were awesome in it. So and I always want to take the side of the Muslim sister and being like, good for you for getting that done. But I do want to ask, and we've talked about this off camera, and I just want to talk about it because there is definitely what's the word? I don't know how to say this in a nice way. So there are a lot of people that totally hate you. Okay, I'm just going to
I know.
say it in the Muslim community. I know you on a, semi-personal level, so I've reserved judgment because I'm like, okay, she has never done anything to me. So I and honestly, if you're doing good works in the community, I'm going to support you. But for those people that are vehemently against you, and there are quite a few, some of whom I'm really good friends with, I'm just going to be blunt and honest with you, and I've shared that with you
Sure.
as well.
Sure.
And I know a lot of people, because I just don't want you to come on here without having the opportunity to say your piece, because I don't necessarily feel like that's you've been given that platform to do that. But there is this thing with there's a group of Muslim, you guys are in the mainstream Muslim media, and you guys are, Muslim leaders where that's concerned, but there is some animus towards you. One, do you want to talk about the animus? Do you want to clear some of that up, or do you not want to do that today? And I will respect whatever, but I just wouldn't feel genuine
Well, I guess
if I didn't
my
mention it.
yeah, no, no. I completely understand, given your audience and given your friendships and your connections with the community. Here's the thing. I mean, the answer to that question about whether I want to do this now or another time is, how much time do you have?
Right, right,
um, how much time do you have? It's not something I can do in like 2 minutes. It requires a
right.
little bit more depth. And I would be happy if you want to come on and really pick that subject apart in depth. But the long and short of it is that, look, the it is true there are people who really hate me, but I actually think it's like a small group of people who are really really committed to not just me but others, like kind of boycotting a group of us. And for
Right.
the most part, people have no idea what it's about. For the most part, people have no idea. And on the other hand, people who actually know me, even if they don't agree with some of the decisions I've made in terms of the work I
Right.
do, still respect and love me and are
Right.
friends with me, and understand that I have never had a negative intention. Look, I'm 46 years old. I have been in the workplace for like 25 years, and I've done a lot of work. I've done work in so many different spaces, and almost all of it has been in many ways in service of the Muslim community, whether it was immigration law, civil rights law, national security policy. I mean, I go on and on. Um, and so, to me, the issue that people have with me is that I participated in a program called MLI with the Shalom Hartman Institute, which is an American and Israeli Jewish theological seminary. which I did in a completely personal capacity. I wasn't like part of a Muslim organization. I wasn't, it was just a personal thing. And I have personal reasons, which I am happy to explain if you had the time to do it. It's such a, like a small blip in like my 25 years of work, community work. And, but they just can't get beyond that. And um, they also can't get beyond the fact that I will not apologize for it and I won't back down. And the, the problem with this is that this this voice of protest or boycott, whatever it is, against me and the others who participate in this program has grown. We've seen this in the last few weeks, where now it's like, no, this organization also has to be shunned because two members of the board had meetings with these Jewish organizations that we are not okay with, or these pro-Israeli organizations. And so it just grows and grows until what? Until we just cannibalize each other. It's like what we want to do is take an organization that's doing great work for the Muslim community, and because two people on the board are doing something you don't like, out of everything else they do, you just want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think it's really bad for a community. I think it's toxic. At the end of the day, though, I have stopped. And again, I am happy to come back and get really in depth with it, answer all the questions you can get. As I've had people come into my home and say, I'm gonna drill you down. I'm gonna drill you down, and we're gonna get into this, and you're gonna explain all this shit to me, and I'm gonna challenge you. And 2 hours later, they're like, okay, I get it. I get it. And they're fine. But at the end of the day, I spent the first, I think, and I did this program like 7 years ago. It's been a long time, folks. I've been doing a lot of the stuff since then. Uh, Undisclosed, my podcast has helped exonerate, another defendant was exonerated today, 10
Yes.
people in the last 5 years. So I'm doing work that's really fulfilling and important, and I'm not going to stop doing that. And I'm also, anyhow, for the first 6 months after all of it erupted, or a year or so, I did try to like answer everybody's like anger and accusations. But then I realized what I'm trying to do is like respond to accusations that are mostly completely false. And
Okay.
like, what a waste of time. Like, I can't go around doing that. It's like if somebody says, you know, you know, tell us why you eat babies. And it's like, but I don't eat babies. I mean, like, how many times can I go through this circular, like, but what you're saying is not true. I just stopped. I've stopped doing it because I don't have the time or the energy, and it'll prevent me from doing the work that's important and meaningful. That program I was part of 7 years ago, I stand by it. The program has gone on like over, they're like in their sixth or seventh cohort. There are like 120 other people, but I don't know why people are so focused on me and Wajahat Ali, basically, are like our, I don't know why it's just us. Other people have written about it, they've gone through it, but nobody seems to draw the rage like we do. And I don't know why, even though I don't even write and talk about it anymore.
Well, you probably
So, oh,
you're in a public space, right? So that's
But
likely
that
the
public
reason
space has nothing
why.
to do with the public space. I mean, has nothing to do. That public space is mostly because of Serial. And Serial has
Yes.
to do with a case that a young man who's like a little brother to me that I've been working on since 1999. It has nothing to do with the Shalom Hartman program, right? So, I don't understand why people, but I have heard this, and I think this is really sad. And I think it's part of
Mhm.
a sickness that our community has, where everything becomes like a conspiracy, where people have said, well, Serial was successful, or the book was a New York Times bestseller because of her Zionist connections. And it's like,
Got it.
what are you saying? I mean, I can tell people how you can have a New York Times bestseller. There's a formula to it that my publishing company taught me. I now know. I'm working on my second book, and I
Oh, I
can
would love
guarantee
that.
you,
Y-
I,
We'll talk about that on another day behind
see,
the
that's the
scenes.
thing. This is the thing, Zeba. I'll tell you, every time I meet with, like, let's say a group of young Muslims or others, they want to talk about this. And I want to say to them, don't you want to know? I can tell you how to write a New York Times bestseller. I can tell you how to have a
Yeah.
successful podcast. I can tell you about immigration and civil rights and a million other things, but that's the only thing you want to talk about. And you are missing out on a lot of other stuff I could teach you. But
Yeah,
I'll tell you
like
that.
about
It's very,
the history of the Jinn, because I'm telling you, that's why I wanted to have you on. But I do know that we do have certain, and we've talked about this off camera. So I wanted to be authentic and open,
yeah, I
and
think it's fair. Yeah.
it and authentic and open about it. That
Yeah.
there is a hesitation. Do I think it's like I don't know the whole story, so I want people to know
Yeah.
that, and I try to avoid politics. That is my co-host job. My job is to try to see how we can build bridges of understanding, and I do think. Just from the shame perspective, when you do have so many cool powerhouse people, to your point, you can teach somebody how to do a New York Times, and some of these other people have so many awesome things that they can offer that as a community, I would, we all have our skeletons in our own communities, right? And I'm not trying to air dirty laundry, but the only way that I think that we can get to a commonality of understanding is if we do talk about it, right? Which is why these platforms are there. But
Yeah.
I definitely wanted to say thank you. I did not mean to put you on the spot for that. I
Oh no, it's okay.
personally have enjoyed the Hidden Gem is one of my favorite podcasts, and I know Solat has, to totally change the subject, another good question for you that has nothing to do with MLM. No, not MLM, MLI, and Adnan Syed. We're going to be praying for
Okay.
him. And
Thank
Solat,
you.
it
Please
is
do.
your call.
Okay, so firstly, I want to start off with no one judge me. So I just want to start off with that. But I'm Team Edward all the way. So when I was reading,
Oh, yeah.
and so when I was listening to your podcast, I just, by the way, did you ever read the Twilight series, Rabia?
So no, I started reading one, and I would think about a chapter, and I thought, I can't do this. I can't
Okay,
subject myself to it. I'm
okay,
sorry.
so I'll just go back to my question. But so in
But
in
but I've seen. I think I've seen the first movie. I think it's the first movie with my daughter, so I know a little bit about. Yeah.
Oh.
So when I was listening to your podcast, I was extremely interested when I heard that wolves are able to kill jinns that drink blood. Okay. So I'm like, oh my
That's
God,
correct.
Mm.
Twilight. Did Stephanie Meyer do jinn research before she wrote her book? So was it fascinating
Mm.
for you to see the similarities between the different cultures?
You know what? You actually are the first person who's brought that to my attention. I never made that connection. I didn't even think about that. But yeah,
Yes.
I thought this was really
Okay.
fascinating that apparently, according to um, a lot of the tradition that comes out of the Gulf region and the Levant, is that um, the wolf is the one animal the jinn fear. It's the one animal that can kill
Mm.
jinn, and that for hundreds of years, mothers would like make little amulets with like wolf teeth and stuff to protect their children. And I just actually sort of you're the first one to point that out to me. I never even made that connection. But that's interesting. I wonder now. I do wonder if she did some research. But the werewolf also is like the
Mhm.
werewolf is a phenomenon in Western's supernatural lore, and I have never done any research into that, but I'd be interesting to see if there's any connections there with the origin of the werewolf.
Maybe that's
I'm just
another
happy to get the
podcast
answer.
episode.
Maybe. Well, look, my this podcast is 10 episodes, so the season's about to end, and
Mhm.
it was a lot more. I wanted it to be a fun, creative project, but it has been actually a really intense and really hard project. There's a lot of resources, and you want to do justice to them. So we'll see if there's another season that comes out next year, if I have the energy for it or not. But if not
Well, that
next year,
that
maybe the
was
year
going to be
after.
that was going to be my final question. Like, are we going to have any other seasons? And if so, when those were going to come out? But I think you write it, you help produce it. It's a lot of work and research
Mhm.
that goes into it, and it 100% shows. So could you
Yeah.
let our audience? I know we've been promoting it, but can you let our audience know where to find you?
Yeah. So I mean, the podcast itself, the Hidden Djinn, yeah, I research and write every single have Google Podcast. I mean, you can find it on like any podcast app, or you can go to I think if you just Google it, the Hidden Djinn podcast, it'll come up. It's on the Grim and Mild website. They're one of the producers, Grim and Mild. And we are on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, which I'm still trying to figure out how to use, but we are on all three
Ugh.
platforms at the Hidden Djinn. And you'll find us there. And I'm on Twitter at Rabia Squared, and I'm always on Twitter, so you'll find me tweeting about the show there too. So yeah, and every week we post episodes, and I have an ongoing Patreon series that is interviews with people like you guys who've had interesting
Yes.
stories, and also scholars and artists and
Mhm.
writers and all kinds of really great people who have their stories. And I'm really thankful that people are even willing to come on, because look, when somebody like me, like a lawyer or anybody who's like professional, is like, listen, I'm just going to come out and talk about this stuff, whether or not people think I'm crazy, like you're putting your credibility on on the line here.
Yes.
So you can always follow the Patreon series too, which is going to continue after these 10 episodes. But I don't know exactly when season 2 is going to be. It's really going to depend on um, my legal work, to be honest, to see. I
Mhm.
have a case that I have to, that's kind of important, that I have to work on for next year. Not Adnan's case, a different one. So we'll see if I can manage in between the case work.
Well, I know that I was super thankful that despite the power going off, despite the doors opening and crazy lights flickering, we were still able to have this conversation. So I really appreciate it. And for those of you, please, it's Hidden Djinn with a D,
Yeah.
Jinn. See, I did not even know that myself. So please look that up. Thank you, Rabia, for being on the show. So I hope that you can go and get some rest for tonight and that you're not haunted overnight. So I will be
I'm getting
praying for
better.
you for that. Say your surahs and have a good night, ladies. And thank you again for coming on the show, Rabia. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Assalamu
Good night.
alaikum.
Bye-bye.
You can sign up for a free webinar by Guidance Residential by clicking on the link in the description.